But of course, it was 11 years ago today, on the day of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, when then President George W. Bush made his first public remarks about the 9/11 attacks from where he was that day, in Sarasota, Florida. The president had been reading to a group of elementary school children when he was first informed that the attacks were underway. The president initially continued with that part of the photo op, reading to kids, but then he did cut short the overall event. And then he explained why to the reporters who were there to cover it.
Try that again. Get ready.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
The attacks had begun that morning at 8:46 a.m. What you just saw there was President George W. Bush speaking to television cameras at 9:30 a.m., so about 3/4 of an hour after the attacks began. The president, of course, is most remembered that day for the formal address that he gave from the Oval Office 11 hours later at about 8:30 p.m. But in that 11-hour period between those statements, most of that time, President Bush was in the air, right? In the initial chaos of the unfolding attack, as commercial air traffic was shut down over the entire continental United States, President George W. Bush was moved to Florida and to Louisiana and to Nebraska. He was moved within Florida, I should say, to Louisiana and to Nebraska. He essentially spent the day in flight aboard Air Force One before finally getting to Washington, D.C. that evening to give the Oval Office address. One of the technological, logistical changes that our government has made since the 9/11 attacks is that if, God forbid, something like that were to ever happen again, the president would no longer have to land in order to speak to the nation. In Michael Lewis's new long-form profile of the president in Vanity Fair, Mr. Lewis writes, quote, "When they give you the tour of Air Force One, they show you the extra-large doors in the middle of the plane to accommodate a president's coffin, as they did Reagan's. They tell you about the boxes of M&M candies embossed with the presidential seal, the medical room prepared for every emergency. There's even a bag that says cyanide antidote kit. And the conference room, refitted with fancy video equipment since 9/11 so that the president does not need to land to address the nation." Today, there were ceremonies marking the anniversary of 9/11 at the Pentagon and at Ground Zero in New York City and at Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Vice President Biden gave a really emotional speech to family members who had had a loved one die there.
My hope for you all is that as every year passes, the depth of your pain recedes and you find comfort, as I have genuine comfort in recalling his smile, her laugh, their touch. My guess, and obviously it's only a guess, no two losses are the same, but my guess is you're living this moment that Yeats only wrote about when he wrote, "Pray I will, and sing I must, but yet I weep. Pray I will, sing I must, but yet I weep."
Vice President Joe Biden speaking today in Pennsylvania on the 9/11 anniversary. This is the 11th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And commemorating those attacks on this date is now something that we have done for a number of years, but it is also something that is too new to have a sense of normalcy about it. Nobody knows how you are supposed to commemorate the 11th anniversary of this, or the 12th, or the 13th. It has been over a year now since the United States killed Osama bin Laden, the head of the group that attacked us on 9/11. It is a presidential election year. It is a year when one of the wars we launched after 9/11, the one that actually had a connection to 9/11, is a war that is still going on. But the other long war that we launched after 9/11 has been ended in Iraq. And all of those variables factor into decisions about how we mark this day as Americans. but also how our leaders or our would-be leaders mark it, how it functions in politics. How we commemorate 9/11 is a work in progress. But we saw today the decision by the White House and the Obama campaign to have Vice President Obama and Vice President Biden mark the day in a way that was very overtly not political, not partisan. It was just about remembering the people who were lost that day, commemorating all the different sacrifices that people have made in this country since 9/11 and because of 9/11. And while both sides in the presidential campaign suspended their negative political ads for the day out of respect for today's anniversary, there's no ban on campaigning today. There's no rule about what you can and cannot do. Mr. Romney, the Republican presidential nominee, gave a speech today before the National Guard Association in Reno, Nevada, and at times his speech today sounded a lot like his normal stump speech. He did go out of his way to attack President Obama without naming him, but attacking President Obama for defense cuts that are part of the whole sequester deal, which incidentally are cuts that his own running mate, Paul Ryan, voted for in Congress. That's the kind of thing he's been saying on the stump. It's the same thing that he said today in his speech on the anniversary of 9/11. And after a week and a half of solid and bipartisan, rather blistering criticism of Mr. Romney for leaving any discussion of the war in Afghanistan out of his speech, accepting the Republican nomination for president in Tampa, his vice presidential nominee, Paul Ryan, didn't mention the war in his speech either. But after facing all of that criticism, Mr. Romney today, while addressing the National Guard, did not have much to say about Afghanistan again. He stated the fact that we are at war in Afghanistan, and this was the total indication he gave for what his policy would be in that war should he become commander-in-chief. He said, quote, "Our goal should be to complete a successful transition to Afghan security forces by the end of 2014. We should evaluate conditions on the ground and solicit the best advice of our military commanders." And that was it. Mr. Romney has previously been critical of setting a timeline for taking troops out of Afghanistan. When John McCain gave the Republicans' big foreign policy speech at Mr. Romney's nominating convention, John McCain's line on the war was that we definitely should not bring troops home from Afghanistan by the president's timeline. Mr. Romney also at one point during the primary campaign said we should bring troops home from Afghanistan right now. At least he suggested that that might be the wise course. So it's hard to figure out what Mr. Romney's policy might be on Afghanistan, what he might actually do with tens of thousands of American troops who would be approaching year 12 of the war in Afghanistan when President Romney would be taking over as their commander-in-chief. Figuring out what conceivably might be his policy on this, which we have no idea about given the number of different things he has said about it, that is important. But that is maybe less important than the fact that Mr. Romney and his campaign try to talk about the war and try to talk about foreign policy and try to talk about national security as little as possible. Today, a Romney foreign policy advisor told the website BuzzFeed that the whole issue of foreign policy is, and I quote, a distraction. Actually, he even then went on to call it something worse than that. Here's the quote. "It doesn't surprise me that the Obama campaign is raising foreign policy because it's another distraction from the administration's terrible economic record." He then went on to say, quote, "They're going from one shiny object to the next." To be clear, the shiny object he's talking about here is the foreign policy of the United States. He is suggesting that his candidate will not be distracted into talking about something like that while he is running for president of the United States. Well, why should Americans then vote for a man for president who thinks of foreign policy as a distraction, as a shiny object? The Romney campaign has an answer for that, too, explaining to BuzzFeed that Mr. Romney should not be underestimated on the subject of foreign policy. Quote, "The governor is an extraordinarily well-traveled businessman. He lived overseas as a young man." Now, what that reference to there is the fact that Mr. Romney spent time as a missionary in France during the Vietnam War. That was part of how he got some of his deferments from the Vietnam War. The advisor continues, Mr. Romney speaks French. He understands the world. The idea that he's this naive guy at 65 years old, given his experience heading the Olympic Winter Games and everything else, I just don't think that's going to play. While it is true that the Olympic Games that Mr. Romney ran included people from other countries, it did involve the people from those other countries coming to America to compete in Utah, which is where those games were run. If that counts as international experience, so should working at an airport or driving a tour bus with foreign tourists in it in a major American city, maybe even holding a meeting at the International House of Pancakes. Would that count? The Republican presidential campaign is just choosing this year not to compete for the presidency on the basis of foreign policy. And whether or not you are hoping that Republicans win the presidency, that decision to not compete on that issue has dramatic consequences for all of us in the country, because it means that of the two major parties, one of them, the Republican Party, has decided to not come up with a new Republican take on foreign policy post-George W. Bush. There has not been an evolution in Republican foreign policy since the Bush-Cheney era. They see no need to have learned any lessons or changed their minds or changed their orientation to foreign policy as a party because of what happened over those 8 years when Republicans were in charge. Well, Mr. Romney was giving his I don't really want to talk much about Afghanistan speech today. And while his advisors were telling the press that foreign policy is a distraction and a shiny object that they won't be conned into accidentally talking about while campaigning for the presidency, who was spotted giving today's foreign policy briefing to the Republicans' vice presidential nominee, Paul Ryan? Who gave him his briefing today? These two guys. You don't recognize their names in all likelihood. They are not at all well known outside of the foreign policy establishment, but they are foreign policy establishment types from Washington. And they would be very well known to you if you are a student of the disaster that was the foreign policy era of Bush and Cheney. The guy on the left is a former George W. Bush national security staffer. And the guy on the right was one of the guys who ran the Project for a New American Century. Do you remember that? It turns out that wasn't just a crazy conspiracy theory in the blog comments. That really was the Republican foreign policy cabal that was selling the idea of an Iraq war even before 9/11. The Project for a New American Century was a real thing. They tried to get even Bill Clinton to start the Iraq war. They wanted George W. Bush to start the Iraq war even before 9/11 happened. And then when 9/11 happened, they said, okay, yeah, we got to go now, don't we? The Project for a New American Century really existed, and the people who ran it did not get run out of Washington on a rail and forced into a line of work they would be better suited for, like, for example, coloring. No, instead, they are briefing the Republican vice presidential nominee on what to do about foreign policy. In 2012, the Republican side never retired the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney foreign policy team. They have seen no need to come up with a new foreign policy idea or two. They don't seem to really care much about foreign policy in terms of the Mitt Romney campaign. They just do not want to be asked about it. And because of that, because the Republican Party is essentially forfeited on this issue, because on this issue there are not two plausible sides fighting it out in the election. There's the governing party, the Democrats, and then sort of a right-wing peanut gallery that pops up from the previous administration. Foreign policy and the wars are really being handled in our political system differently than any other thing that is being fought over in this election. And you can see that in the polling. 11 years after 9/11, look at where the American public is on the major issues of foreign policy. On Afghanistan, on our war in Afghanistan, the proportion of the American public that wants American troops out of Afghanistan either by the time that President Obama wants them out or sooner than that, when you combine those two numbers, it is 82%. On Iraq, the proportion of Americans who say it was not worth it is 2/3 of the American public. The proportion of Americans who say the Iraq war was worth it is just 1/3 of the American public. That's the highest ever number that said the Iraq war wasn't worth it, and the lowest ever number who said it was worth it. In terms of the impact of the Iraq war, look at this. Americans by huge, huge margins agree with the statement that the experience of the Iraq war should make nations more cautious about using military force to deal with rogue states. Also, Americans by huge margins think that the Iraq war worsened our relations with the Muslim world. Americans by similarly huge margins believe that the Iraq war will not lead to the spread of democracy in the Middle East and that it did not reduce the threat of terrorism. Huge margins. The proportion of the country that says defense spending shouldn't be cut is now below 1/3. Should we take unilateral military action against Iran? The country says no. Should we send troops to Syria, as was suggested by John McCain at the Republican convention? The answer from the American public is hell no. Would you rather the U.S. military went it alone or acted along with NATO or acted along with the UN? We Americans, 11 years after 9/11, now very much prefer the multilateral options, and we prefer them in a big way. Should the United States be more willing to make decisions within the United Nations, even if this means that we will sometimes have to go along with the policy that is not our first choice? The answer is yes, please, work with the UN. The American public on foreign policy is kind of liberal now, to the extent that you can ascribe the word liberal to the idea that we don't want to be like Bush and Cheney were anymore. We don't want to go back to that. And maybe you shouldn't call that liberal. But there's definitely no reason to call it any partisan term that is specific to any party. Because what we find about foreign policy in terms of American public opinion really has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Look at this from this new report today on American public opinion on foreign policy. Contrary to conventional wisdom, the foreign policy opinions of Americans in red and blue districts are remarkably similar.